Welcome to today's CFR meeting with Ri Chang-yong, the governor of the Bank of Korea. This meeting is part of the C. Peter McCullough series on international economics. I am Richard Clarda, a professor of economics at Columbia University and a global economic advisor with PIMCO and CFR member. And I'll be presiding over today's discussion. We are joined today by CFR members attending in person in New York, right here, and over 100 attending virtually via Zoom. I'll begin with a very brief introduction of Governor Ri. The bio is available and very lengthy, so I'll just some highlights. Dr. Ri currently serves as the governor of the Bank of Korea and is a member of the board of directors of the BIS. His career spans more than 30 years with professional experience that includes senior positions at the IMF, the ADB, the Financial Services Council, as well as academic appointments at Seoul National University and the University of Rochester. He's published extensively on macroeconomics as well as on the Korean economy, and holds a PhD in economics from Harvard and an undergraduate and honors degree in economics from Seoul National. The plan for the session is the governor and I will be engaged in a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will have opportunity for questions not only in the room, but also from the audience on Zoom. Governor, let's begin. Korea inflation has returned to the 2% target and currently stands at 1.6. Congratulations. This is an excellent achievement. And it seems that you won the fight against inflation earlier than major economies, including the U.S. So what made this possible? And going forward, what's your outlook for Korean inflation?
Thank you, Mr. Clarida. And also, I'm very glad and I'm honored to be here. As for your question, I think I can mention three factors. First, I think the Bank of Korea and my predecessor start to raise the rate from mid-2021, well before the global inflation started. So in some sense, this proactive policy helped me to tame the inflation better, even though at the time, the main reason of the inflation hike was not due to the inflation, but at the time we had a very rapid increase of housing prices. So my predecessor started as a part of macroprudential. Second factor is I was lucky to have two finance ministers who had a firm belief of fiscal soundness. So they had a less expansionary fiscal policy during the period of inflation. So unlike many other advanced economies, this more contained fiscal policy helped me to tame the inflation in those periods. Third is definitely monetary policy has worked too. We raised our interest rate about 300 BPs while the US raised 500 BPs. But US peak inflation is well above 10%, and Korea's peak inflation is about 6.3 in July 2022. And so inflation was lower, peak inflation lower, but at the same time, we had our most mortgages are floating rate loan, whereas the US is more fixed rate loan. So 300 BPs in Korea, 300 BP increase in Korea is a significant impact on 500 BPs in the United States. So three factors altogether, it helped us to achieve the disinflation relatively earlier than others. Looking forward, I believe we have some concern on the geopolitical tension in the Middle East because oil price has a large impact on our economy. But if I exclude that uncertainty, I believe that the price stability will prevail and our inflation will be around 2% in the coming future.
Well, again, congratulations. Also, congratulations having fiscally responsible finance ministers too.
I was lucky.
So it sounds like, at least given where things are today, that if you had a last mile problem, it was not insurmountable. Was the path down to target a straight line, or was it more of a bumpy road. In many countries, including the U.S., there's been discussion of the last mile disinflation.
Yeah, I think our pathway to price stability was far from smooth. And I can mention one important factor is how to manage the exchange rate volatility during this path, especially when U.S. start to have a giant hike, 75 BPs of increase for 4 consecutive times.
Yeah.
That drove up the dollar strength and emerging market exchange rate, including us, our exchange rate depreciated quite significantly. Flexible exchange rate works, and unlike 1997, when we look at our balance sheet of our bank, Korea became a creditor. So actually, in 1997, when exchange rate depreciated, we had to pay back the loans and there is default risk. But now, currently, since we are the creditor, actually we find that the depreciation work for our balance sheet of the bank. So we didn't have a reason to worry very much. But having said that, the people has a bad memory in 1997.
Yeah.
So when the exchange rate approached 1400, I had a lot of criticism. Now we are heading for the risk crisis, all kind of argument, and many people ask me to solicit Fed swaps from the U.S. or kind of thing. So, but in some sense, it was important to manage the expectation given this high depreciation period, and also there's technical reason that we had to intervene in the market, because our derivative market is less developed. Mm-hmm. Most maturities of derivatives are less than 6 months or 3 months mostly.
Right.
So when the exchange rate hit some bound that market participant expected before, it triggered a kind of vicious circle. It triggered margin calls, and in order to meet the margin calls, financial institution has to finance through the internal market. So domestic interest rate increased a lot more than we expected. So in some sense, we definitely needed to slow down the speed of depreciation, even though we do not change the direction. And so handling this rapid interest rate increase period of the U.S. policy because of the FX market was not easy.
Can appreciate that. Of course, central banks, including in Korea, focus not just on price stability, but also financial stability. In August, you delayed a policy shift considering the risk to financial stability, in particular, rising house prices and household debt. But of course, earlier this month, you decided to lower the policy rate and shifted the policy stance. So does this mean, in your view, that the financial stability risk has gone?
No, not at all. But as you mentioned, we cut our reference rate by 25 BP in October 11. But actually, the pivot decision was not straightforward either. In terms of price stability, as our inflation is approaching 2% for sure from July on, we were ready to having a pivot from July. But that is a time when U.S. now is a little bit different. But at that time, many people expecting that the U.S. will cut the rate aggressively. And that kind of expectation drove down interest rate, not only in the United States, but many emerging markets, including us. Yeah. So these days, I think it is a big headache because our interest rate moved together with the Jay Powell's remark than mine. So, so around July, our interest rate, market interest rate actually went down a lot more than I wanted to. And that caused the housing price in Metro Seoul area start to increase more than we wished for. And together with that, household mortgages start to increase. And our Monetary Policy Committee members believe that it's better to wait the rate cut until the macroprudential becomes strengthened. And as we wished for, government introduced more strengthen the macroprudential policies. And in September-October period, the housing prices and the volume of the transaction has reduced quite significantly. And with that, we decide to cut the rate. But from now on, you don't know what will be the impact of rate cut on the housing market until you see it, right?
Yeah.
So we're gonna watch how the housing prices and the mortgages will behave after our cut. Then we will decide how we're gonna manage this pivot down the road. But we have a lot of criticism because inflation is below 2%. Why you think about financial stability too much, and because our growth rate is kind of in the neutral position. So we got a lot of internal criticism that we had to cut the rate before thinking about financial stability. But our Monetary Policy Committee member believes that the emerging market central bank has to put more weight than others on financial stability in addition to the price stability. So that was the main reason why we managed the speed of the cut.
Well, especially given the context of global capital flows as being a driver consideration in emerging economies, less so than in the U.S. You had an interesting interview in the FT recently, which could be read as giving some warnings about a housing boom. Is it unusual for a central bank governor to speak out so specifically about structural forms and housing boom, and more recently minimum wage to education? Very refreshing to me, but not necessarily common. So
I knew that there are many critics who said I'd rather better just focus on monetary policy. But believe me, there are some who support me. Okay, I think two things. I think that many central bank actually has a research on various topics, such as fiscal policy, labor market issues, and recently Madame Lagarde actually gave a speech on the structural reform. So I think it's not true that the central bank research has to just focus on the monetary policy alone, right? Yeah. But in our case, I really want to make Bank of Korea to be the leading think tank in Korea. And actually, there's many structural issues such as education, housing, and the labor, and how do we employ more foreign workers. All these issues are very important in Korea at this moment because of our low fertility rate and the demography. So maybe the education, all these things sounds strange, but you can think about that the structural issue that I just mentioned is much more important in Korea than other countries. Yeah. So as a think tank, we have to study it. If I explain a little bit more, we find that our fertility rate at this moment is 0.7, world lowest. So and then when we study why the females refuse to have a baby, it's mostly because of the people are moving, young people are moving to Seoul and metro area when the competition is become fierce in getting house and getting the education right. All this competition make many female workers not to work. Instead, they just focus on their careers. So overall, I think the low potential growth rate in Korea, very expensive housing in Seoul area, and all this education zeal and competition is related with these structural issues. And definitely, I believe central bank as a think tank has to show some of our opinions and the research on this topic. Having said that, I also believe that I do not believe that monetary policy is one thing and structure is the other. Structural issue really constrain the limit on the monetary policy. For example, our decision in August, why we didn't cut the rate despite the low inflation rate, is because of structural issue, which is housing price in metropolitan area. And we believe that the housing price in metropolitan area is very hard to even control with macroprudential policies because there is a huge demand for the private tutoring in a certain area of Seoul, and people jump to that area, whatever. So we just wanted to mention that unless we crack this kind of structural issue, even monetary policy the effectiveness will be limited. So in that sense, I'm proud that we continue to do so. But definitely, some people are very unhappy, say that you had better cut the rate, and do not, be distrayed by all these issues. But difficult to persuade at this moment.
But I took note of your comment about thinking of your team in the context of having a think tank, which is certainly something that I noticed during my time at the Fed. The incredible human capital among economists in the Federal Reserve system, oftentimes doing very relevant research that oftentimes is either not done in academic settings or is maybe done in academic settings 10 or 15 years too late. And so I applaud that focus.
And actually, I want to say that is why I like your speech and your research when you're in Fed.
Well, anyway, okay. So certainly something that's relevant not just to Korea, but internationally is, as we're sitting here, really the reshaping and rethinking of global value change, supply side management, reflecting, of course, many drivers, one of which is technology, but also, an ongoing trade dispute between the U.S. And China. And then these trends were just accelerating in the midst of the COVID pandemic and then obviously the war in Ukraine. Korea is obviously very much positioned both geographically and technologically, in this system. So how have you thought about this in the context not only of monetary policy, more broadly, the outlook for the Korean economy and in particular trade growth and the reshaping of supply chains?
If I not limit myself as a central bank on price stability issue, I think that the most important risk and challenges and opportunity is the changing global value chains. And Korea, as you know, has benefited a lot, and we are probably the most significant beneficiary of the global value chain in the last 20 years. When China was the center of the factory of the world,
yeah,
and we were linked with China we have benefited a lot from China's rapid growth and the spread of global value chain in the last 20 years. Now, after the pandemic, and also with the increasing tension between the United States and China, we all know the global value chain started to change and also will evolve in the future. So what will be the new global value chain will look like is a very important issue for us. So that's for sure thing. And at this moment, we also understand and realize that importance of resilience of global value chain rather than just the efficiency of global chain. So we are also definitely country which focus on China plus one strategy. And we are moving out, also diversifying our factories around the world. And that is a trend. And if we probably, new technology, we probably have more chance to talk about more details. But having said that, I think what's happening in Korea at this moment, you cannot just say that it's due to the US-China tension, what's happening now. Because we have this kind of trend, China plus one and the diversification trend, well before the trade tension started between the United States and the US. Probably we see from the data very clearly that our export to China start to decline around 2013-14.
Really?
Yeah.
I
think it's simply because it's the competitiveness of Chinese industries.
Yeah.
So, you can discuss why they become competitive, subsidy, all those controversial issues. But in some sense, it's a natural thing for us to understand now that as China becomes a little bit richer country from the low-income countries, their industry becomes very competitive. So ex-post now we believe that the Korea businessman is a little bit complacent and enjoy the previous 20 years of high Chinese growth without expecting that they will catch up with us rapidly as we caught up Japan previously.
Yes.
So I think this definitely the new global value chain was a part of the result of China's increasing China's competitiveness, and we probably has to, take into consideration.
Well, something that I know has been anticipated has now come to pass. So earlier this month, FTSE Russell decided to add Korea to its benchmark bond index, starting, I guess, from November of next year. Congratulations. What does it mean for your country? And in particular, impacts presumably positive on Korean financial markets.
Yeah. Actually, you run PIMCO, so probably we have a high expectation that PIMCO will raise Korean share in the future. Actually, it was really good news to Korea, not because that we will have a lower financing cost for our government bond, but actually, I think, in my opinion, that this is a demonstration that our structural reform effort acknowledged in the world. When I was a professor and then I was a former government officer 10 to 15 years ago, when we tried to liberalize our capital market and change the FX market structurally, there was a high resistance from the top government officers, especially Treasury, on this is because we really saw always ability to control the exchange rate is the most important thing in macro management. So flexible exchange rate was not well understood. But I think the new generation, while I was away for 10 years, when I get back to Korea, I realized that our younger generation is more open-minded for the capital account openings. And in the last couple of years, the effort to free up our market to the foreign investors, including we extended our operating hours of our onshore exchange market from 3 p.m. to 2 a.m. in the 7 hours extension. We also allow the registered financial institution abroad can directly access our the onboard in the exchange market. And also we start to allow the electronic trading platform. All those kind of effort is now being acknowledged. So I'm very happy. In terms of effect, I think since the real inclusion will be from November, it will be very hard to see when the real impact of the capital inflow or exchange rate will happen. That also depends on how much the bond investment in PIMCO can be hedged or just come to naked. But I'm very happy in the sense that by including in a FTSE index, there will be more money from the long-term investors than hard money. And also by promoting our government bond market in domestic currency, not dollar terms. That will give us a more ability to use the FX, exchange rate flexibility more aggressively. So in every sense, I think it's a good achievement, and we have to continue.
Well, could not have a session with the governor of Korea without asking about China. In particular, China obviously is an important driver of the global cycle, but obviously very relevant into the Korean outlook. And it's widely expected this year China will grow below the official 5% target and perhaps continue that disappointing trajectory next year. So how does the outlook for the Chinese economy and the weakening outlook have implications for Korea specifically and Asia more broadly?
I was in Beijing last week, so I updated my understanding. When I was in Beijing, the third quarter number, 4.6% growth rate was announced. So that was slightly lower than what people have expected. So you're talking about 4.5 to 5% growth rate this year. And they recently announced the new stimulus packages. And this 4.6% hasn't reflected the impact of this new stimulus plan. So people are discussing how big the new stimulus plan will be in terms of growth rate. So, but whatever the outcome, I think I find that the mood in China was a little bit less bright than this 5% suggest. I think it's easily understood if you just look at the nominal growth rate. And in the last 6 quarters, China's nominal GDP growth rate has been lower than the real GDP growth rate, which means that they had not as severely as in Japan, but they have this deflationary pressure. So overall, when I talk to businessmen, if I just summarize the current situation in one sentence, they produce a lot, but not making much money. So there are a lot of production, and now there's internal competition is very high because domestic growth rate is not as high as they wanted. And now they went outside to sell those products. And in that sense, I think China's slower growth is definitely not a positive thing for us. But at the same time, the overseas production of Chinese companies is now can be there will be a winner and losers in Asia, depending on your situation, because many ASEAN countries become a destination of China plus one strategy. But at the same time, many Chinese companies actually went outside, and they are actually investing a lot in Asian and other countries. So, this really with the changing pattern of the global value chain. So.
And certainly one thing that I've noticed as well and done some work on this is you actually see in some of the data a diminished correlation between the Chinese cycle and the global, say, commodity cycle, or striking before the pandemic, you would see eyeball correlations, pretty striking relationship between the China cycle and then the global cycle, commodities and trade. And it began to weaken during COVID, and it really is still rather weak. So part of that structural evolution that you talked about,
and also nature of their growth, and around global financial crisis, their growth was led by the infrastructure investment, housing investment, and so that means more demand for the commodity.
Very commodity intensive.
But the nature of growth has also changed. So.
Yeah. Well, I guess we couldn't have any conversation without discussing AI everywhere, including in the stock market. It even dominated the Nobel Prizes this year in physics and chemistry. According to The Optimist, AI is widely expected to transform the global economy. But maybe I can narrow the question down a bit. How are you thinking about AI in the context of Korean economy, and more specifically, are you trying to leverage AI inside the Bank of Korea?
I think Korea is, in some sense, a unique situation in terms of the impact of AI, and because on production side, Korea is one of the rare countries who can actually produce AI-related chip competitively.
Yeah.
So at this moment, people are just focused on the AI chip on servers like NVIDIA chips.
Yeah.
But as AI technology develop further, we believe in the near future. This is really a big assumption, and it's not yet confirmed by many others, that if the AI become a kind of technology used for many areas, and especially if AI technology start to be used on on-device equipment like mobile phone and others, then maybe more cheaper AI chips, the demand will be very higher, not just for the server chips.
Yeah.
And Korea will be the biggest beneficiary if that happens, because in producing chips, we have a competitive edge, and our companies, Samsung and Hynix, really have a competitive edge in producing AI server chip as well as other high-quality chips. So that's what we are expecting for. And on the application side, I find that our youngsters are very much IT-friendly. Mm-hmm. We have a very well-developed IT infrastructure. So I see rising, business, small businesses are created on the many AI-related services like medicine, medical services, biotics and robotics in many areas. So even in application side, we see this is an opportunity. So we'll see. And you ask me what we are doing on AI side on the Bank of Korea. We are the same food in the other central bank. We are exploring how we can improve our operational efficiency using AIs. We actually, now forecasting all this, forecasting and the analytical work, but at the same time, we're trying to develop our own chatbots to help our operation, all these things. The biggest issue for me is how much investment I have to do it in advance, or whether we have to wait and then try to buy the kind of ready-made, off-the-shelf product later, or whether we have to invest money a lot in advance. That's a quite difficult question, and the amount of money that we are talking about is not small. And I personally do not have any good technical knowledge. So when our staff asked me to sign the bill, I was a bit uncomfortable. But this is an issue that how much we have to invest. But definitely we will be more positive on AI investment because we have a domestic companies who can actually help us.
Yes, well, that's certainly a good position to be in for sure. I thought we have a little bit of time before we go to the audience Q&A. I thought maybe, since it's certainly something that I benefited from during my time as Fed Vice Chair, and also you have a very senior leadership position in the BIS, maybe if you could just share with us the BIS infrastructure for convening central bankers and your impressions of it and what specifically you're doing in that context.
Yeah. Actually, I'm a newcomer as a governor. I didn't know that. I heard a lot about BIS, but I have more experience in IMF and other global institutions, especially probably I'm more familiar with finance minister trail rather than the central bank governor trail before I joined the BIS. I find that the intimacy of the central bankers are much more tight than the finance minister, naturally, because finance minister stay 1 or 2 years and the central bank stay 10 years very easily. So they know each other. And so it's quite, they're very close friendship in the BIS meetings. And especially I really like the BIS, there is a closed door session and among governors, and they can very speak privately and without having a concern on their remark can be exposed to media. So it was a great setup that I learned a lot. Especially I was lucky because I joined at the time the global inflation was start to increase quite rapidly.
So what was your first meeting as governor?
I was appointed in April 2022.
Okay, wow.
So yeah, so it's the time that inflation. If I knew it is going up like that, I probably have not chosen. But I think by joining the BIS meeting, I could guess what others were doing, and that really helped me to plan for our monetary policy. I was lucky. Great institution.
Yeah, it is indeed. Okay, I think we will now move on to the remaining time we have to Q&A. And we're going to invite questions both in person in the room and on Zoom. If you're in the room, please raise your tent card to indicate your interest in asking a question of the governor. And do speak into the microphone, because, and also just a reminder, this meeting is on the record. And so we will start with a question or two here in New York. So if you have a question for Governor Reed, please raise your tent card like this. Okay, right there, please. Yes.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
I have to turn this thing on.
Oh, Amir, sorry, my glass, a little dark in here. Please, yeah.
So, free advice on AI, wait. But my question pertains to China. And both Richard and Ben have no doubt know of Bob Alaba, whose standard theory is that all developing countries have 15 minutes of fame in the sun when they enter the world when they enter the world economy. They grow like gangbusters, attracts a ton of hot money. At some point, this creates an internal crisis and the whole thing collapses. And he cites, of course, as examples, Korea and the Southeast Asian countries. And for some years, he's been banging on about China. And I guess now his predictions about China have come true, more or less. But Korea seems to have not only had its 15 minutes of fame, had its crisis, but then has moved on. If you were to advise the Chinese on what they could do to move on, putting on your sort of structural hat, not just your monetary policy hat, what would you advise the Chinese?
I think your question can be divided in two parts. One is whether China will have a kind of crisis that Korea has experienced first. Okay. And then second question is that what China has to do to move on from now on if their growth rate is moderating or slowing down. First part, I do not think China will have a same kind of crisis that Korea has experienced, simply because they have not much foreign currency denominate debt. So to me, if China has a crisis or difficulties, it's more like a misallocation of the capitals into a very unproductive area, such as state-owned enterprises, all these things. So they may suffer from a slower growth more than necessary because of this kind of policies, but that does not necessarily mean they will have a very abrupt, the FX kind of crisis that Korea had. So if somebody is, when I was in IMF and ADB, I got a lot of questions, similar questions from the Wall Street, when the China will collapse and all this, because of high debt. I say, no, don't expect too much because their debt is more domestic currency denominated debt. They have a lot of real estate under the government book. So if they sell some of them, they can easily recapitalize the bank. So it's a matter of the slow growth rather than abrupt crisis that many emerging markets experience. So that's my answer to the first part. Second part, if they have some issue of the resource allocation for higher productivity area, that is a very difficult question, and is also well beyond the economics, because at this moment, looks like Chinese high authorities have very little incentive to move on to the private market by reducing the size and the size of the state-owned enterprises. They believe state-owned enterprises has many functions, not just for economic functions. It's a kind of building block of their political system as well as a social safety system. So the million-dollar question is that whether you can be successful in increasing the innovativeness or the productivity using the industrial policy and the state-owned enterprises. Nobody has done it. I say that in case of Korea, I think the 1997 crisis is really costly and painful, but at the same time, they had a positive impact for restructuring our economy, and we could move to a more higher productivity society, partly due to the crisis. But in case of China, the billion-dollar question is whether they can achieve the new standard of. So at the bottom, they are very successful to become a middle-income country through the industrial policy using the state-owned enterprises. But whether they can move on to the higher level, still based on the state-owned enterprises, I don't know the answer.
Alaba, incidentally, would include Japan, which did not have much external debt as part of his model.
Japan, sure, yeah. I think their currency is internationalized, and a lot of Japan's debt is, in terms of Japan's own currency. So I don't expect they will have a crisis, but it's more market move.
Right there.
Hello, thanks for your remarks. I'm Ron Tiersky from Amherst College in Massachusetts. I'm not a Korea specialist and I'm not a finance guy. I'm a Europeanist and a geopolitics guy. The one thing we all know about South Korea, which you touched on, is the birth rate.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you to talk more about that. You were congratulated for the low inflation rate. I don't know if you could be congratulated for the low birth rate. We know about K-pop, and you're having great success, and all, and it's really remarkable that South Korea is so vigorous from that point of view. As a Europeanist, I can recall a joke when the German population in the 80s and 90s began to go south. There was a joke which was, will the last German please remember to turn out the light?
Yeah.
So my question is, first, something specific. Do you think that the South Korean birth rate is likely to remain about the same, go up, or go down? What might, what effect might that have? What is the relation of the birth rate to the financial system, the economic system, and are you really worried, or is it okay?
Yeah. I'm really worried, The 0.7 is really low number. And I was interested in this issue, demography issues, for a long time as a professor. At that time, by looking at the European data, I saw that our fertility rate around that time, around 2%. And I saw that our, not 1.5%. And I saw that our fertility rate will go down to like 1.2 or even close to 1% by looking at the European cases in the worst scenario. But now we have 0.7%, which is, I think, is unimaginable in like 15 years ago, even by looking at Japan's data. What I'm doing is personally, I'm trying my best. So my eldest daughter just got married, and I asked her to having a baby as soon as possible. whether she will listen to me or not, I don't know. But I think Korea government has to do two things. One is that even if we will be successful in raising the birth rate to above 1%, by looking at what other advanced economies, probably at maximum we can expect 1.5 rather than go back to 2%. So, and also that even if that helps, that will happen. New labor supply will only be realized after 22 years. It's 20 years. So I think in between, it's inevitable to have more foreign workers, even if I'm not talking about immigration, but immigration including, it will be very hard for us to avoid not having foreign workers. And Japan, probably Mr. Steyer knows very well, and in 20 years ago, they were very reluctant to inviting foreign workers. But after suffering low growth rate and the necessity of helping the elderly, finally, after Abenomics, they start to incorporate foreign workers. So if you go to Japan now, you can see many foreign workers. So somehow, I really think that Korean people has to be, I've put in a word, educated, but Korean people have to understand the inevitability of having more foreign workers despite some social problem they are worried about. So that is one important policy change that we would like to talk. That is why it's controversial for me to talk about this immigration foreign workers. And second, definitely we need to improve the fertility rate. And I don't think there is one panacea to help that, because it's more like a voluntary decision of the youngsters because of the heavy competition and many different issues, especially housing prices. Housing price goes up, people are very uncertain about their life, all these things. So that cannot be solved by one policy, and definitely we have to give more incentive for people to have a baby. We have to use the fiscal resources to do it, but that's not panacea. So I think that we need a lot of effort in reducing the cost of living. We have to reduce some competition of the unnecessary competition in education. We have to probably change the culture of the businesses where toward the female workers. All these things is necessary.
Let's move around to this part of the room. Sorry, can't see your name, but please, right there. Yeah.
Thank you. Kilaparthi Ramakrishna from the Woodsole Oceanographic Institution. But the question has nothing to do with the Oceanographic Institution. I was in Korea as head of the Northeast Asia office of the United Nations and had the opportunity to work with you in your capacity at the time with the Blue House. One of the things that we had to deal with while in running that office was North Korea. And the question was more about finding information that is reliable for various purposes. And I found, this is going back to the comment about Bank of Korea as a think tank, I found lots of very useful studies about North Korea coming from Bank of Korea. And then the analysis is, I thought, when we talked about this with various other economists, was spot on. And then it talked about a time when it becomes simply not viable in continuing on the path that it is on. But here we are, a decade or so later, it's still continuing in the same way. And I was wondering if you could share any reflections on what you think is happening in North Korea and what you see as the future of the two Koreas.
If you invite me again after I resign from the governor position, I'll be more free to talk. But you know that not many people know that Bank of Korea is producing the official, from outside, official GDP statistics for North Korea. So we actually and don't ask me how we get it. Don't ask me how correct it is. But we work from many various agencies to get the information, and especially from the border of China and North Korea. And so we get a lot of, we are trying to get a lot of statistics for North Korea. But I think at this moment, I think, especially given this week's kind of sensitive situation of in North Korea, please allow me. I shall refrain from commenting on the North Korea because it's more diplomacy and security issue. As a central banker, I probably have to refrain from. Thank you.
We do understand. Next question. Yes.
Thank you very much, Marcia Vanderberg from San Francisco. Governor, you mentioned the chip industry in Korea, in South Korea, and particularly AI as it applies to AI. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that. What percent of the economy you see that now being, and what percent of the economy do you see it becoming? What are the drivers? Is it more a policy or a competition? And then how you will manage, how Korea will manage the tensions that currently exist between U.S. and China, particularly over chips. If you just sort of talk a little bit about the stake in the ground for South Korea in the chip industry. Thank you.
I think I forgot the exact number of how IT sector account for in our export. So if it's a significant, but I think I forgot the number. And it has a lot of spillovers to other industries too. So IT sector is very important. And we have been, for example, but China was a big market for our chips. More than 50% of our chip export went to China before the US-China tension. So definitely that won't go on because there's a technical sanctions of the United States on the very high-end technology to China. And our very high-end chip is top exporting to China at this moment. Low-end chip, we have more competition with China. So this will definitely change. But on the other hand, the demand for chips actually increased quite over the world. So in the short term, because of competition and the sanctions, we may have some difficulties. But I think given that if you look at how many countries can actually produce chips, and also this sanction of the United States in some sense has an impact. China was quite an important competitor, but now because of sanction, I think probably we have on some time for them to catch up later. So there is a pros and cons. So chip industry still we believe is one of our strengths of Korean economy. And so I don't know whether this answer is enough.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Next.
Chuck Weiss, retired from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I wonder how your admirably broad gauge think tank is dealing with climate change, what you see the impact directly on Korea and the effect of the global change on Korea.
I have to admit that I'm very proud that Bank of Korea is doing many things. Sometimes we have been criticized, but climate change, I wish we could have done more. At this moment, we are doing, like many other central banks, we are doing something more, focusing more on analyzing the climate impact on the financial market stability. We are developing the several stress test kind of scenarios. We do some kind of education role for the public and overall, and then also we are trying to, invest our foreign exchange reserves into the more green bond and other things. So we are doing many, but whether this is big enough, we have certain limitation because Korea is a little bit slow in adopting the many climate change, policies because we are very much manufacturing based, and there are a lot of resistance from the industry to adopt the carbon tax and others, understandably. So I'd rather say Korea is in many fronts, we are in the front line, but climate change, we are not behind, but I think there are a lot of room for us to do it. I'm not just talking about the central bank, but government as a whole. I believe there are more things we need to do. And definitely we see the climate change is having an impact on us widely. Our agricultural production pattern has changed. And many fruits that we have raised before in southern part is now moving to the northern part. So that has a lot of price impact, inflation impact too. And the rainfalls these days are more like in Bangkok rather than in Seoul. So that actually has a lot of implication of how we have to update our infrastructure, such as water control kind of thing. So I think before too late, I think we had a better focus. We have to invest more money on this climate change issue, but which is starting very slowly.
Do we have any questions okay, please.
Yeah, I'm an institutional investor. You mentioned U.S. dollar appreciation, the impact that has had on emerging markets. Could you talk a little bit about prospects for a reversal of the appreciation that we've seen over the last many years in the U.S. dollar against other currencies? As an economist, not as the governor of the central bank.
I think you are asking in the last months, after now people start to realize that the U.S. economic growth is much more strong, and now people readjust their expectation of the interest rate cut of the U.S. Fed, emerging market currency depreciate together with dollar strength. And now that is also affected by some uncertainties of the U.S. election result and the future economic policy of the U.S. So I think at this moment it will be a little bit hard. There are too many uncertainties. I'd rather answer and then rather guess what will be the future path of U.S. dollar after the election, because there are a lot of uncertainties, and then how the monetary policy will change. But one good news for us, at least, is that the emerging market currency depreciation is quite common across the countries rather than one or two countries are singled out. So in some sense, previously, depreciation was kind of regarded as evidence of weakness of a certain country. But this time, the market whole understand this is depreciation because of strong dollar. So in that sense, the impact is smaller. So, but we'll see how it goes.
Right there. Hi.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jean. I'm with Google. You had mentioned earlier immigration, which was what my question was about. So I had lowered my placard, but actually, you also had mentioned the post-Abenomics introduction of more foreign labor in Japan as well. But what is kind of from a socio and economic perspective in Korea, the research that you're seeing around immigration in Korea?
I use the word foreign workers intentionally because somehow immigration, there is not much consensus yet to having more immigration. And actually what's happening in Europe and United States and other advanced economies about this immigration issue does not help us to promote immigration immediately. So that's why I'm using the word foreign workers as a kind of transition. And still, but I think I'm sure people will understand that we need more foreign workers. And then if you start to accept more foreign workers, probably we can open our mind for the immigration down the road. But at this moment, because Korea and Japan and Asian countries are compared with Western countries, it's true that we are a little bit more conservative in having an immigration. So, but I think at this moment, as I mentioned, our study shows that it will be very hard for us to manage our life without having our foreign workers given rapid aging. So our baby boom generation will become, in next 10 years, will be older than 75 or 80. So in down the road, 10 to 15 years later, the elderly care is a big issue, not only the low birth rate. And I can see a lot of pressure too. So whether we like it or not, my first point is that having more foreign workers is inevitable. And then once we got familiar with having more foreign workers, maybe we may open to the immigration down the road.
We have time for one more question. Anybody want to? Maybe I'll ask one last question, the remaining time. Any lessons, since South Korea is a success story in terms of the disinflation, you went early. You didn't mention inflation expectations. I'm assuming that they remained well anchored at your target throughout the surge in inflation.
Yeah, in the beginning, it seems to start to increase together with actual inflation.
Yeah.
And our consumer expectation on inflation is very much track the actual inflation. On the other hand, expert opinion on the inflation was kind of well anchored for our policy. To do that, actually, we introduced some experiment and still controversial. So I do not want to claim that it was my legacy, but we introduced the so-called dot plot of the U.S. Fed. And before—
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This controversial. And when I become a governor, I think the general understanding of monetary policy and my predecessor was mostly believer of the strategic ambiguity. So Bank of Korea was very careful not to mention the future paths of inflation.
Yeah.
And I have a little bit different. I'm a little bit more kind of academics and I'm trying to test a few things. But I liked, in some sense, dot plots. There are pros and cons. But I thought that instead of having a 2 to 3 years horizon for the dot plot, which is too much uncertainty in case of Korea, which is a small open economy. But on the other hand, not talking about future paths at all seems to be too much because Bank of Korea has more information than private sector. So if you do not show any signal and say that no signal is better, I feel like that's too much. So what we introduce is so-called K-dot plot, which is we just talk about what is the opinion of the Monetary Policy Committee members for the next 3 months, 3 months later.
All right.
And then I thought that somehow by announcing what is a kind of conditional expectation about the 3 months later interest rate by each member of the Monetary Policy Committee, 7 members, excluding me. I know that my opinion will weight a lot more than that. So we announced a 6 members expectation about the next 3 months interest rate. And the expectation actually followed very closely with that announcement. So far, I think our experiment was not a failure. It's a good condition.
I had not known about that. Okay, well, thank you all for joining today's meeting, and thank you very much to Governor Rhee for speaking with us. Please note that the video and transcript of this session will be posted on CFR's website. Our meeting is adjourned, and have a good visit to the United States.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.